we escorted French bombers as well as English, and I received the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms for these various protective measures we gave the French and English in the number 3 wing operations.
The heroic flying career of Raymond Collishaw, the man you just met, spans more than 2 world wars and has been compressed with difficulty into a little more than 2 inches of small print in the Canadian Who's Who. A partial list of just his decorations is story enough for half a dozen heroes. Collishaw, Air Vice Marshal Raymond, CB, DSO and Bar, DSC, DFC, 2 OBEs, 1 military and 1 civil, and France's Croix de Guerre with 2 palms, among many others. Today, in his mid-70s, Raymond Collishaw is retired at his home in West Vancouver, BC.
We came here about 20 years ago, after I retired from the Royal Air Force. We liked the beauty of the place, and I liked it in particular because one could see the expanse of the sea. We are completely surrounded by trees here, and we like the privacy.
He spends his winter vacations near Palm Springs, California, where Telescope found him in the company of fellow flyers who cherish remnants and replicas like this Sopwith triplane from the Dawn Patrol days.
You know, incidentally, I'm the dean now. I'm the dean of all countries. I outlasted them all, you know. Yeah.
Early in World War I, Collishaw left his native Nanaimo, BC, to enlist in the Royal Naval Air Service, years before it was merged with the Royal Flying Corps to become the RAF. At the stick of his famous Sopwith Black Maria, he commanded an all-Canadian quintet called the Black Flight Squadron and personally downed 60 German aircraft, a British record that is second only to the late Canadian Billy Bishop's 72. Those were dazzling days of daring do, and Collishaw is one of the very few daring doers to survive them.
I had an adventurous, wonderful life, and I wouldn't have changed it for anything, really. In the wintertime, I do air historical research work. When we find something in history that doesn't seem to us as being logical or proper, we examine it, do research on it, and eventually approve it, or whitewash it, or do something with it to make it satisfactory to us from the historical point of view. I've created rosters for all the RFC and RNAS squadrons, for the German JASTAs, and for the French escadrilles, and for the American squadrons. And I've also established an air casualty register, which takes into consideration the names of all those killed in all the years 1914 to 1918. It includes British, American, Canadian, German, French, Austrian, and Italian. And I hope someday to get the Russians in.
The name Stuart Taylor would probably mean very little to the average Canadian. To a number of the surviving Canadian pilots of the First War, it is probably quite common. I've been writing to these gentlemen for a number of years, gathering information on their service. And the information that I've been gathering will eventually be put into documentary form, into a type of who's who on all the Canadians that served in the First War. This is his first full command, sitting in the middle. About half the pilots are Canadians. Art Whaley, Fred Armstrong, Jimmy Glenn, all household names in the annals of RNAS history. Here is a very good picture of the battle ruins of the town of Ypres, over which B Flight, the famous Black Flight, flew in those very, very dark days of June and July 1917. This was almost a landmark, and many of their outstanding battles were fought directly over this area. John Sharman is the gentleman who kept a very fine diary. He was the let's say, the recording officer of number 10 Naval Squadron B and C flights. Over here we have a photograph just recently acquired. Collishaw, right from the beginning, must be considered a born leader. He had that magnetic personality that is a rare quality in anyone. When the going got rough, he was there with his big, cheery smile. He was always smiling. He smiled throughout the whole war.
But generally speaking, showmanship or any trickery didn't enter into the field at all. It was straightforward dueling, and the best man, the luckiest man, won. It was more luck than it was anything else. I always think of myself as most successful as a squadron commander, and indeed in the First War I commanded 3 fighter squadrons successively, which I think no one else in the world did at that time. In the Second World War, I was the commander of the Royal Air Force Desert Air Force in Africa, and the African campaign for 2.5 years.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
I took part in 10 small wars between the 2 big ones, and we found out in those small wars that a pilot can get killed just as dead in a small war as he can in the big war.
I met him in 1917 when he came to visit my parents because my brother had been killed where he was in France.
My wife had 3 brothers who were fighter pilots, and all 3 were killed, one in 1916, one in 1917, one in 1918. And so, because of my close association with her brothers, I naturally met her in 1917. And then we were engaged for 6 years. I didn't want to get married because I was keen on adventure, and I realized that marriage would tether my activities as an adventurer. And so we hung fire in our engagement for 6 years, then we got married.
45 years and a bit.
I often regret now I didn't get married because we'd been much younger with our children. As it was, we were considerably older than they, as ordinary parents. And it's difficult for older parents to get closely in touch with children,
Well, he was always, of course, the hero in our eyes, and as well as being a father.
My wife is a very accomplished woman. She knows all about service life and that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Wonderful housekeeper and a wonderful mother. She blended in with whatever had to happen. She just went along with it. And she was always right there beside her husband.
My generation had an excellent time because when I was a boy, Canadians never went abroad. And when they went to the First War, it was the first major occasion when a vast number of Canadians really saw the world as it was, rather than what they heard about it in their schoolrooms. But of course it was very expensive in those days for a young man. For instance, in our case, we all had to pay $400 out of our own pockets and pay all our living expenses. We got nothing in the way of allowances or any pay for the first months we were in the game of learning to fly. Oh, I wanted to fly.
Of the famous black flight that flew during 1917, we still have 3 survivors. Mel Alexander, living here in Toronto. Mel was credited with 20 or so victories. Ewart Nash, residing in Welland. Jerry had 5 to his credit before he was brought down on the 26th of June, 17, quite early in the career of the flight. And of course, Ray Collishaw.
Each flight had its own colors. One was blue and one was red, and in my picture case it was black. The engine cowling and the wheel covers and various small parts like that were colored black. And as they were colored black, the men began to call the flight the black flight whenever they were talking about going, we're waiting for the black flight.
Sherman had the Black Death, Ellis Reed had the Black Roger, Nash had the Black Sheep, and I had the Black Prince.
Collishaw called his aircraft the Black Maria after the famous London paddy wagons, and used this name to more or less keep the rest of the members of his flight in line. They did this as shown by the number of machines they brought down, a total of 57 between May and the end of July 1917.
Well, this is just after I had attacked this Albatross Scout. What had happened here was this took place on July the 6th, 1917. We got into an awful mess with about 25 Huns. And came over from the left. And I've just passed over, and I opened fire at about, somewhere maybe 125 feet. And I could see my tracers going right into him, and I saw the pilot fall forward. But we were at about 12,000 feet. And you don't stand around waiting to see what happens to him. You just either know you hit him or not.
Then when the flight became more or less famous, the newsmen picked the idea up, and they've perpetuated the term black flight from that day to this.
He was a man's man, and he was one of the boys. There was a great spirit of camaraderie between himself and the other members of the squadron.
Jerry Nash and I were on the tail of the flight. That's one of the things where Collie that Summers' humor used to come out, ironic humor. He'd say, oh, well, the two sacrifices, they're all right. Let them stay in the back. We were known as the sacrifices.
I deliberately adopted a policy of trying to make everybody happy. Some young fellows have a tendency to go to their cabins and mope and think about the dangers of tomorrow whence they might be wounded or killed. So I deliberately adopted a policy and seen to it that all the officers went in the mess and had a jolly good time there, sing-song and drinking as a matter of policy. And it worked, too.
That is Collishaw right through. I have never known a more, what's the word we want, ebullient, but I never saw him depressed in all the, number of months I was flying with him. I never once saw him. That's where he was so good. He was a very excellent squadron man.
In 1918, His Majesty the King came to inspect my squadron. Official photographs were taken on that occasion, including the photographs that are well known and obtainable now from the Imperial War Museum in London.
He's still the same, too. I saw him a year ago out there, and Collie hasn't changed too much. He's like the rest of us, a little thinner in the hair and a little stouter, but outside that, personally, he hasn't changed too much.
It's a wonderful life, really.
World War I is far enough away now, so there's a lovely kind of a romance and a glamour about them, like Wellington's charge. And I think that this, plus the fact that I think it was really the last time of gallantry in action as we know it. I mean, as we think of it, knights in armor, knights in the air, and one of these days, I know that we will have a series. And whether it'll be done here or in Canada or England, I don't know. But I know that this whole period of time of World War I is so glamorous and so exciting to the people of today that it has a very real potential. And fortunately, we have the capabilities now of being able to do this when it wasn't possible even to do it in Howard Hughes' time. There are more actual aircraft available today than there were in the early 1930s.
Yes.
And of course, the camera techniques and the skills we can give back to the people, actually the ability to sit in the cockpit and fly while you're actually making a tail-end run on something. So make a very, very exciting series.
Yes, a great part of my life was spent in the desert, and always to do with flying or the Air Force. But I think that my chief accomplishment in life was when commander of the Desert Air Force in Africa, which incidentally was a Commonwealth Air Force, included units from Egypt, Australia, New Zealand, India, from England, Canada, all the dominions. So I had the experience of administering countries and control of the country in all respects. My wife and I usually go down south to California, to Desert Hot Springs. There's natural hot water there in hot springs, and you can spend the whole day in a pair of bathing trunks, going in and out of the pools, drinking beer in between times. It's a little heaven.
The flight commander of A Flight in July and August 17 still survives in Vancouver. He's the famous Nick Carter.
He shot down quite a distinguished German pilot of JASTA 11, which was the most distinguished German JASTA. I'm not familiar with the details of it, but he has a piece of it, of his aircraft.
However, I got this fellow over the top of the Ypres Canal, and I got him started down, and I stayed right on his tail until he crashed in the canal. And I went up to the front and where he was, and got this rudder off the airplane, brought it back to the squadron, and eventually I had it crated up in a small crate and brought it home to Canada with my luggage.
This is a lineup of number 3 Naval Squadron commanded by Raymond Collishaw. The aircraft at the time were painted in very gaudy colors and designs. But shortly afterwards, when they moved to Mont-Saint-Loire to start the war, the authorities made them remove the markings as they would be too easy to recognize by the Germans.
Every fighter squadron was given a half day off a week. And on that day that they got the half day, these kids went wild. You go into some big town, paint the town red. Well, they'd get in there, say, 2 or 3 in the morning, maybe 4, pie eyes and roll into bed, you see. About an hour later, when dawn, the orderly would come, wake this fellow up, and say, "Night order book, sir." Well, he'd turn himself out of bed, get up and wash and get dressed and go out. That was the very last thing he wanted, you see. There was something very peculiar about the air. As soon as you got that in the fresh air, it cleared your brain. Quite normal again after 15 to 20 minutes, but at first you couldn't get any sense out of them. A sharp difference that existed between the Second War and the First War was to do with the audience. It was a sporting affair because it was 50-50 shots for each. And on each side of the trenches, the Germans, on seeing their boy wearing their national colors, said, "That's our boy." And on the English side, again, they would say, "That's our boy." And there would be cheering going on in the trenches as one side or the other side overcame its adversary. The air was the theater for tens of thousands of troops watching the sky. And in those conditions, with a tremendous audience, each pilot wearing his colors of his country, he couldn't very well run away, even if he wanted to, with this tremendous mass of people watching him. So it was a fight to the finish. So it took quite a different kind of character to suffer that kind of terrible ordeal compared with an ordinary fellow. The most terrible things could happen to a fighter pilot was to get locked in a deadly embrace in what was known as a waltz, where you went round and round and round, continuously, endless turns, each opponent trying to get on the tail of the other fellow. And of course the other fellow, very anxious to see he didn't do that. If your aircraft was getting onto the tail of the other fellow, you could see what you were doing with your nose of your aircraft by watching the other fellow's face. His face showed that his time had come.
Of all the flyers in the famous Black Flight, Raymond Collishaw certainly took a liking to young Jerry Nash from Stony Creek. Jerry Nash was a very likable boy and a good pilot. if a little aggressive. It was for this reason that Raymond Collishaw looked after Nash. He protected him, and he took a special liking to him. When Jerry Nash was brought down, it was a very great loss to Collishaw and other members of the flight. Sharman described the incident with the following entry in his diary. Collie's flight went on patrol at night and came back without old Jerry Nash. The nut got separated from the rest and started to scrap a red albatross, Almenreuters. And 2 of our artillery saw him come down on the other side of the lines, under control. So I guess he's all right. Damn it anyway, we needed Jerry. I hope he's all right.
It's very difficult to assess one's achievements. Early pilot's life required personal bravery and personal application with my own hands and my own brains to do what was required. I like the Canadian way of life. And in Canada, one is not required to exert or display nationalism as in other countries. Indeed, it's quite proper to be a BC Canadian or a Quebec Canadian with equal advantage in both cases. In Canada, people are really free of outside interference, national interference or provincial interference. In other words, Canadians are free living people.